Hi, everyone. So we're heading into week 6 now, I believe. And this week and next week, we're going to be talking about capitalism. And this week, we're going to be talking about virtues of capitalism and typical arguments, some of which I think you'll be familiar with as to why capitalism is a good, effective, and efficient economic and social system. And then next week, we'll take kind of a different view and look at how capitalism can, those instances in which capitalism doesn't work well. I think this is important. You're probably not used to thinking in terms of capitalism, um, but I think this is useful here. I'll define capitalism in a minute. And we often equate capitalism with a market economy, which is true. There's a little bit more to that definition. Um, but I do think it's important when we get to later topics in the class, specifically problems that afflict cities, such as environmental pollution, poverty, even traffic, transportation problems. I think it's helpful to think about those problems within the context of a capitalist market society. And that's not the only way we can think of those problems. We can analyze them from different angles, so to speak. But I think it's good to have this larger context in mind. So hopefully that will be helpful as we move along here. Now, I am pretty much following in this lecture the chapter that we're reading for this week. And it's a pretty good one. It's not very long. And we also have another paper that is posted on Canvas on libertarianism. And I would like you to read that. And that's a good statement for thinking about the virtues of capitalism. But the authors, Eric Wright and the other authors, start off this chapter talking about the major characteristics of capitalism. They have, I think, 3 of them here. And it's pretty straightforward on some level. Production is organized for the market. So what is a market? People make something, grow something. Historically, markets have existed for thousands of years. People, grow food or make something and go sell it to somebody else, and that is basically the market. In current date thinking, we can talk about businesses or companies or firms, whatever we want to call them. Businesses is probably the best term. Businesses out there that the grocery store to the high-tech company, they make things to sell on the market. And there are people who purchase those things. So that's pretty much all you need is a buyer and a seller. The second characteristic they state is that the means of production are privately owned and investment is privately controlled. So the means of production is kind of I think is a little bit of a confusing term. I mean, what the heck does that mean? The means of production. The term is used a lot in by some economists, but basically the means of production, that is the factories, the natural resources, machines, buildings, all that stuff that's out there. Probably the clearest kind of example is, let's use the factory. There's a factory or company that's making something, and that factory is owned by an individual entrepreneur, or it may be owned by a larger corporation that owns a lot of different factories. But the point is, it's privately owned. The government does not own that factory. The government does not control what the owner or owners of that factory make. Um, the government doesn't decide what they invest in and so on. That is in private hands. So probably the simplest way to think about it again is think of an individual entrepreneur that owns a factory or a company that makes something, and that owner, he or she, controls the show, decides what to invest in, what to produce, and that kind of thing. And then the third characteristic they state is that the work of production is performed by employees who are hired from free labor markets. So basically, somebody owns the factory, and then there are other people who kind of are, in a way, selling themselves on the market. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. People are saying, hey, I'll do the work for $15 an hour, $30 an hour, whatever it is. And then the entrepreneur, the capitalist, the person that owns the factory says, I don't want to rent you to do the labor. I'm going to rent somebody else so I can get them a little cheaper, or they have better skills. So these three characteristics combined for the authors, and I think it's pretty helpful, are the definition of the major characteristics of capitalism. Now, before proceeding further, and this is straight from the chapter again, I'm not deviating much in this lecture from the chapter. The authors make the point that, it'd be a mistake to say that we live in a purely capitalist economy. You probably have heard in different contexts, different places, or read somewhere where, capitalism is just a great economic system because we don't have government and Big Brother on our back. And the more we can get government out of the economy, the better. And that the US is great because we are a capitalist economy. But when you sit down and think about it, that's not entirely true. The authors make a good point here. Educational services, for example, are provided by public schools. And I guess there are, of course, schools at the high school level and different levels that are private. But for the most part, you probably went to a public school. Most of us did. I did. And that is organized through government planning. There's not a private entrepreneur out there saying, okay, I'm going to charge you $50 a day to go to school here. It's free. So it's organized and implemented by the government. There's other examples. A lot of cities produce their mass transit systems. Some do a good job, some do not such a good job. But it's not just a private company that's producing it. So the government does play a huge role in our society and in the way that we organize economic activities. A couple more examples. Nonprofit organizations provide a wide range of services within communities. So, there's hundreds of thousands of these. They're usually pretty small, located in the Los Angeles area. They're not privately owned. They're a nonprofit company. So the YMCA, for example, it's the only example I have that comes to mind, is a nonprofit organization. There's another company, another nonprofit organization, Communities for a Better Environment. And they're located near Long Beach. And they work with communities to try and help them keep their communities free from environmental pollution. They're not a private company. They're not organized by one individual who's trying to maximize profits, but they are a nonprofit organization, which anybody can form one, and they do get paid a salary. They have to raise their own money through grants, and they provide these services. One more example, and this is one that the authors elaborate on, is our libraries. And they use this example to make the distinction between private versus government or public. When we say public, we're typically often referring to government. So, libraries provide books for people. So it doesn't matter how much money you have, how much money you make, or who you are, or whatever. You can go to a library and check out a book. And if the book's not available, they'll put it on hold and get it for you. Now, you can also get that book in a bookstore, but you have to pay for it. And the bookstore is going to charge you as much as they can. That's the essence of a market economy. Those who are selling things are trying to maximize their profits. So let's say you can't afford to purchase that book, but you can only purchase it through the library. So the authors have this discussion. It's a little kind of helpful just to help us just be aware that it's not correct to say that the US is purely a capitalist economy. And we could investigate these further. We could say, well, is it more efficient to have books distributed through libraries or through bookstores? Is it more efficient to have our mass transit produced by private companies or by government? And those could be some very interesting discussions. But we'll move on here. So I think the title of the chapter is something like this: Major Arguments in Favor of Capitalism. And there's a couple of them that the authors, a couple of main arguments that the authors identify. And I think these arguments will, on some level at least, resonate with you. We hear these arguments, these ideas in favor of capitalism. We hear them in the popular media all the time. We hear our politicians make reference to them all the time. If you're reading the paper, there'll frequently be comments made in reference to these. So it's fairly popular. I think some of it will resonate with you. There is a moral argument, and that is that capitalism promotes individual freedom and liberty. And this probably resonates with you on some level. We live in a free society, and the reason why we live in a free society is this sense that we don't have a lot of government on our back. We can do what we want. And that really is kind of parallels ideas of the free market economy, capitalist economy. So this argument is often associated with the political philosophy of libertarianism. There's a large libertarian political party in our country that really strongly advocates a purely capitalist economy because it is so conducive to having a free society where civil liberties are very advanced. We can say what we want. Big Brother is not looking over us. So take a look at this reading. I probably will have a question or two on the quiz from the article or the reading on libertarianism. This quote is a good example of the philosophy of libertarianism, summed up in one brief sentence: the government that governs least governs best. And this was a statement that was made by Ronald Reagan, who was president in the early 1980s in the United States. And he was a strong advocate of capitalism and free markets. The second one, and somewhat similar to the first, although the first one's focused more on the political freedoms, that uh, that are a result of a capitalist economy. This one focuses more on the the practical economics of capitalism. And the idea here is that free markets are the most efficient way to organize economic activities. There's something about a market economy that is just very powerful, very efficient, and very resourceful. Now, the key to this free market economy is price, supply, and demand. So if you have a good that's to be sold on the market, those who make that good will put a price to it. And the higher the demand there is for that particular good, the higher the price is going to rise. When the price rises, entrepreneurs will respond by increasing the supply and producing more. So what would be an example here? Let's think of the example of, well, we'll use the example of housing. Now, housing, if you want to purchase a house in Los Angeles, it's very expensive, as we all know. And why is that? Because there's a huge demand. There's a huge demand for housing. There's more people that want housing than there is existing housing. So therefore, the price is going to go up. Now, over the long term, the supply should increase. And the supply of housing did increase for decades. And builders know that they can make a lot of money now building new housing developments. So eventually they will see that, wow, the price is high. There's a lot of people wanting to buy. So I'm going to build and sell and make some money. And so this is, now in the case of housing, the supply of housing being built has been pretty slow for other reasons. But I'm just using the housing example because I think that that can kind of resonate with us. But if we take this logic to another level and think about being in a grocery store at Vons or Albertsons or whatever, and think of the hundreds of goods that are on the shelf. The dynamic of price, supply, and demand operates on each of those products. From a can of soup to a bar of soap to a six-pack of Coca-Cola. The market has this way of communicating how much people are willing to pay for each of those goods. And when people start, buying more of something, that price is going to go up. And then eventually those who are making it will say, hey, wait, oh, there's, money to be made by producing more. And then that will kind of bring it down to an equilibrium level. We can use the recent example here of toilet paper especially at the beginnings of the COVID pandemic. For the first couple of months, there was a huge demand for toilet paper. Everybody was going out and buying toilet paper. You couldn't find it on the shelf at Vons. So the price of that toilet paper started to go up because producers knew that people were willing to buy it. And then they also started to increase the supply because there was more to be made. So I hope these examples kind of make sense. So the dynamic of price, supply, and demand will determine what things are produced, how much of a thing is produced, how things are distributed, who gets what. And it really boils down to this simple formula. Price is the major communicator in the market economy. And it speaks to, not literally, but it speaks to, it informs producers, those who own the factories, how much they should produce. And it informs consumers, what's out there and the value of various goods. And ultimately, in the larger scale, this allocates society's resources very efficiently. There's no government authority communicating this information. So it effectively coordinates a complex economic system. The authors talk about, give the example of government planning versus decentralized markets. Prior to 1989, when the Soviet Union still existed, it was a communist society, or it claimed to be a communist society, but it was a society that had central planning. So you had government planners, and they were economists and other people, but they would essentially decide how much steel should be produced each year, how many automobiles should be produced each year, how much food should be produced each year. And then they would communicate this information to factory owners. Well, they weren't factory owners because that wasn't allowed, but to the managers who ran the factories. And it was criticized as a very economically inefficient system. There are oftentimes shortages of certain things, certain goods. In other areas, there would be too much, an oversupply of certain goods. There would often be shortages of food. And the argument was that the economy in modern day societies are too complicated, too complex, too large to have a kind of central planning board decide what needs to be produced. Decentralized markets are so much more efficient. One more comment on free markets. This is a famous quote by Adam Smith, who wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations. This is in the 1700s at some point, so this is a while ago, but it's stood the test of time. He was writing at a time when markets were becoming larger and used as a bigger part of kind of local economies, and kind of soon after industrial capitalism was kind of starting to emerge. And so he put into words the way in which markets work. And he used this idea of invisible hand. And market economy is analogous to an invisible hand. And it's really, I think, focusing here on price. As I mentioned before, price is communicating things to everybody, but nobody can really see, it's not a person. Price is just informing producers and consumers. And this becomes very efficient. So anyway, this is a famous quote that he had. An individual who intends only his own gain is led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Nor is it always the worst for the society that it was no part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectively than when he really intends to promote it. So that might sound a little bit confusing here, but it is a famous quote. And I think part of this quote too, I should have added earlier, Adam Smith is making the point that if we're all going out there in the market economy pursuing our own self-interest, that really is a good thing. So if I go to a baker, this is the example that Adam Smith uses in another part of his book. If I go to a baker and the baker doesn't give me or make me a loaf of bread that is at a decent price and a decent quality, I'm no longer going to go there and purchase his bread. I'm going to go to somebody who purchases bread for a reasonable price and good quality. The guy or the woman who does not promote the good piece of bread is going to go out of business. And so, while I'm just trying to promote my own, I'm just looking after myself, trying to do the best I can for myself, I'm actually helping the economy and society to be efficient, because those producers who are not good are going to go out of business. Okay, so let's see here. So the third and final argument in favor of capitalism from the author's point of view is that a free market economy creates powerful incentives for innovation and economic growth. This is, I think, something that we can relate to. There is an opportunity out there to create something, come up with a new invention, to come up with a better way of doing something. And we can make a lot of money if we do that. That serves as a big incentive for innovating. Think of some modern day examples. There's a lot of small examples, but if we look at someone like Elon Musk, so he's kind of invented perfected the electric car, and all these amazing innovations are associated with the emergence of the electric car. And he did that maybe out of the goodness of his heart, but certainly one of the incentives is to make some money. And this is a good thing from this perspective. It creates jobs, it creates economic growth. Economic growth leads to more wealth, that kind of thing. And another aspect of this is not only is there an incentive for the individual entrepreneur to make something, but the capitalist markets put considerable pressure on firms to innovate in order to survive against competition. And this makes the economy very efficient. Those who don't produce what the consumer wants, those that don't stay on the cutting edge, those that don't continue to improve things and try to please the consumer, basically they're going to go out of business. And it's kind of a competitive environment out there. So firms are forced to innovate. And in the long run, this is a good thing because it creates, again, economic growth. When we have economic growth, we have wealth, and wealth makes us happy. Now, I don't necessarily agree with all of these views, this one in particular, but this is the argument that many people make and truly believe in favor of capitalism, that economic growth, if you're making things, producing new things, you're creating wealth, and wealth makes us happy. And that's a good thing. The more we make, the better, the happier we are. And, we as consumers want that. If we didn't want that, we wouldn't be buying iPhones every year. But iPhones make us happy. So this is the logic of this part of the argument. You have economic growth, more wealth, you have improvement in the standard of living. Standard of living includes, the material items we have, iPhones and so on. But it also includes, healthcare, education, all of those other qualities that make a society strong and good. Those things get better with economic growth. And then this makes us happy. Okay, so that's all I have for this lecture. And again, it pretty much parallels the chapter. It'd be very good to do the reading do to read the chapter, and it's very informative. And also read this article on libertarianism. And that's all for now. Okay, if I can end here, let's see.